Thank you very much and enjoy the evening, and it's great for Terry to come because Terry's had a few health issues too, so it's great to see you. Thank you.
Well, welcome again, and it's a very great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Terry Curtin, who will speak to us tonight about Meister Eckhart, the great German medieval mystic, if that's a correct description, and who was an enormous influence on Carl Jung. And Terry has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a Bachelor of Theology, a Master of Arts in Theology, and a Diploma of Transpersonal Counselling. And he'll reflect on how Meister Eckhart, a 13th century Dominican theologian mystic, had such a profound impact on Carl Jung. Terry's philosophical and theological journey began in 1950 from a tribal Irish Catholic culture. He felt called to be a priest, and a seminary training was structured around the infallible doctrines and dogmas of the Catholic Church. His perception of what it means to be human and how humanity is related to the great and mysterious other has gradually but radically changed. After 10 monastic years, Terry left the seminary. Marriage, children and careers in the public service, private enterprise and voluntary services. Nearly 60 years followed. His encounter in about 1980 with Carl Jung's great autobiographical book, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, was transformative. And by 1965, he had a Bachelor of Arts degree from Adelaide University, majoring in political science and psychology. But Jung was rarely, if ever, mentioned. Pavlov's dogs got more attention in the psychology. In Jung, he felt the breath of life, theologically, psychologically, and spiritually. Terry continued part-time studies in theology, transpersonal psychology, and biblical Hebrew, and also undertook training in the Tarot and Kabbalah. Terry first joined the Jung Society in Canberra in about 1985, and later in Melbourne, the Melbourne Jung Society. In a recent conversation with a fellow Jung Society member, the question arose, who was Meister Eckhart?
Thanks, Robert. I'm not too sure is this working, so...
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me, okay?
Yes.
And that voice.
Okay. I had a slide presentation to go with this talk, but my computer skills are rather poor and I couldn't get them to go. But I've got the talk, so we'll proceed with that. So Carl Jung and Meister Eckhart, in his early 80s, he was about 82, Dr. Jung began recounting his memories to his secretary. The ensuing book, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, which had such a big impact on me, I first read it over 30 years ago, was published in 1962, the year after his death. And recalls being about 16 or 17, he was avidly reading history and philosophy, and he says, above all, I was attracted to the thoughts of Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Empedocles and Plato. Their ideas were attractive and beautiful, but somewhat remote. Only in Meister Eckhart did I feel the breath of life. So, and they went on to say, not that I understood him. Jung's feel for Eckhart persisted throughout his life. He referred to him in his writings, it's claimed, over 40 times. In a letter written in his early 80s, he said, I often thought of Meister Eckhart, who was entombed for 600 years. Now, over the last few months, I too, now at the same age as Dr. Jung was when he wrote that letter, I've been thinking of Meister Eckhart. Who was he, and how did he influence Carl Jung? Entombed for 600 years, said Dr. Jung. It was in March 1329 when Pope John XXII he condemned 28 of his propositions. As far as the church was concerned, he was effectively buried. In the late 1950s, I was studying Thomas Aquinas, Eckhart's contemporary. And while other luminaries at that time were prominent, Albert the Great, Duns Scotus, Bonaventura, we never heard of Meister Eckhart. We were immersed in a training regime that had been generated by the Council of Trent in the 16th century and was pretty well unchanged since then. Condemnation of heresy was the dominant theme of the Council of Trent. Eckhart would have seemed like poison to us. How things have changed. Eckhart today is very highly regarded. One scholar of medieval mysticism, Anne Bancroft, says he is now ranked as one of the great teachers of all time. Rudolf Otto has compared him to Shankara, the Vedantist philosopher of the 8th century. Dr. Suzuki believes him to be the equal of the Zen patriarchs. The philosopher Hegel took him as a teacher, as did Martin Heidegger. Now, Eckhart von Hoffheim, he was born in eastern Germany in around about 1260 AD. The church at the time was markedly worldly. An eminent authority on the medieval church, Professor Richard Southern, tells us, secular motives were everywhere uppermost and everywhere prevailed. Many contemporaries were beginning to think that the church was a conspiracy between secular and ecclesiastical authorities for the exploitation of ecclesiastical wealth. And the Pope, as head of this conspiracy, was in fact Antichrist. Now, these views were not yet very influential, but they were disturbing and were destined to grow. So it's not surprising that many people at the time became disillusioned with the institution as a vehicle for personal salvation. That God was to be found primarily within the soul of the individual was to become Eckhart's central message. It may well be that Eckhart has something to say today to the many people who no longer find the breath of life in the institutional church. When he was about 15, Eckhart joined the Dominican order. He was an outstanding student, was sent by his order to the University of Paris, the then World Centre of Learning. He returned to his native, Thuringia, in the 1290s. He was appointed vicar of the province, prior of the Dominican community at Erfurt. Within a few years, he was again sent to Paris for a more advanced study. At the beginning of the 14th century, the order was expanding rapidly. In 1304, Eckhart was put in charge of the province of Saxony. 1307, made Vicar General of the province of Bohemia. Apparently he was a very capable administrator, a popular one, as well as an eminent theologian. In 1311, his order again appointed him to the chair of theology in Paris. 2 terms in Paris was a rather rare honour, shared with only one other, Thomas Aquinas. He acquired the status of Master, so known thereafter as Meister Eckhart. After Paris, he went to Strasbourg, where he served as a Vicar General with pastoral responsibility for the many women's convents in southern Germany. He was closely associated with the Beguines, women who lived religious lives in structured communities, and whose views often disturbed the bishops. It seems clear that Beguines, like Margaret Porret, she was burned at the stake for heresy in 1310, and Mechtilde of Magdeburg influenced his thinking. In 1324, his last appointment was to the Centre of Dominican Studies in Cologne. Today, Dominicans speak of 3 towering figures in the history of the famous Cologne institution: Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and Meister Eckhart. In 1326, the first accusations of heresy were made against him, leading eventually to his condemnation in 1329. He was often asking for trouble with church authorities, with a style of preaching to the ordinary people that could be seen as dismissive of the institution. He's assured his listeners they didn't have to go to church to find God. He said, if indeed a man thinks he will get more of God by meditation, by devotion, by ecstasies, or by special infusion of grace, than by the fireside or in the stable, that's nothing but taking God, wrapping a cloak around his head and shoving him under a bench. There were other factors in his condemnation. Being in tune to some extent with the feminine Beguine fringe troubled the hierarchy. Matthew Fox suggests his radical critique of the dominant merchant mentality of Cologne, at the time irritated both ecclesial and civil authorities. The rivalry between Dominicans and Franciscans played an important part. Eckhart's chief accuser was the Archbishop of Cologne, reportedly a Franciscan. You know, accusations of heresy weren't uncommon. The Dominican Thomas Aquinas himself was cited for heresy 3 times. The Pope who condemned Eckhart was himself declared heretical by the Pope who succeeded him. Eckhart was both a scholastic theologian and a preacher. The primary role of the Dominican was to preach. His scholarly treatises were written in Latin, as was his defence against the charges of heresy. His sermons were in German, Middle High German was the designation given. They were given to students, to nuns, to the common people. Apparently he was regarded as a master of the German language and is credited with being a significant figure in the flowering of the language. Now, it's no surprise that the German-speaking Carl Jung was comfortable with him. Not only comfortable, but quite familiar. Luther and the other reformers found in Eckhart support for their criticisms of Rome. Jung's father and uncle, they were Protestant pastors. Doubtless the young Carl Jung would have been exposed to Eckhart's thought in the family discussions, which often focused on theological issues. So, in this presentation, I've selected a few specific references by Dr. Jung to Meister Eckhart. Why these references? Because they give to me at least a sense of the breath of life that I feel Dr. Jung was referring to. I've grouped them under following headings, and at least I've given a little handout there, that a one-pager, and it's got the headings that I wanted to talk about. So you read them there: direct knowledge of God, relativity of the concept of God, the search for meaning, value of the soul, God winks at our sins, the motherly aspect of God and the birth of the divine child, the way of letting go. And also on that sheet I've handed out, there's a little excerpt that Jung extracted from Eckhart's writings, and I'll be referring to that a bit later. It gives you a little bit of a taste of the way Eckhart wrote. A very strange way. He's a strange man in many ways. Anyway, the first one, the direct knowledge of God. Actually, I need a drink of water if someone could. So, direct knowledge of God. Bible on one hand and Aristotle on the other. That's the image of the scholastic theologian of the 13th and 14th century. Meister Eckhart, he was both a biblical scholar and steeped in the traditions of the pre-Christian Greek and Latin masters. So was Carl Jung. If you read Carl Jung, you'll know how learned he was in all these ancient authorities. They often refer to the same ancient authorities. For example, Eckhart often refers to the non-Christian Seneca, 1 BC to 65 of the Common Era, who wrote about the presence of God in the soul. So did Jung. As far as I can see, Meister Eckhart's usual practice, whether in his scholarly Latin treatises or his popular German sermons, was to begin with a biblical text and elaborate on it in the light of reason and the teachings of past authorities. So you see him referring to Augustine of Hippo, Albert the Great, Aquinas, John Scotus Erigena, Dionysius the Areopagite, Jerome, Aristotle, Plato, Avicenna, Moses, Maimonides, Seneca, the list goes on. They're often referred to. So Eckhart built on existing teachings, expanded them to offer new insights, but he also experienced direct knowledge that he felt came from God. He would use the expression, "This is a truth beyond speculation that has come directly from the heart of God." Now some of these would be shocking. For example, "That God is God, of that I am the cause." He would go on to say, "If you don't understand this, don't worry about it." And he would laugh at himself. He'd say, he's compelled to preach these things, and even if the church was empty, he'd preach them to the poor box. But it's little wonder that ecclesiastical eyebrows were raised. He was censured for exposing simple people to ideas which could lead them into error. Now, Dr. Jung seemed to be in awe of Meister Eckhart, of what he'd achieved through personal experience, as distinct from discursive knowledge. In one of his major later works, Ion, he said, I'm quoting Jung here, "The world-embracing spirit of Meister Eckhart knew, without discursive knowledge, the primordial mystical experience of India, as well as the Gnostics, and was itself the finest flower on the tree of life of the free spirit that flourished at the beginning of the 11th century. Well might the writings of this master lie buried for 600 years, for his time had not yet come. Only in the 19th century did he find a public at all capable of appreciating the grandeur of his mind." That's already noted. Jung, when he was exploring the big questions of life, said he was impressed by Plato and Pythagoras, but they seem remote. There's nothing remote about the young Carl Jung's sense of God. If you're familiar with Memories, Dreams and Reflections, you will recall his account of being overwhelmed by the image of God destroying the Basel Cathedral by dropping an enormous divine turd on it from the throne in the sky. So hypothetical discourse about God had nothing to do with what for Jung was a living reality. Even the leading scholastic thinker of the Middle Ages, John Aquinas, seemed to him to be, quote, as dry as the desert. He fumed at the theologians. They want to prove a belief to themselves, whereas it's a matter of experience. They seem to me like people who knew by hearsay that elephants existed, but had never seen one, and were now trying to prove, by rational arguments, on logical grounds, such animals must exist. Now that's how Dr. Jung remembered his early impressions. Later he would write, "I find that all my thoughts circle around God like the planets around the sun, and are as irresistibly attracted by him. I feel it would be the grossest sin if I were to oppose any resistance to this force." So now I'll just turn to the relativity of the God concept. Jung's most extensive reference to Eckhart appears in Psychological Types. It's one of Jung's major works. This was first published in 1921. 5 years or so prior to Psychological Types, Jung engaged over a 3-year period in deep introspection that finally came to light in about 2009 with the publication of the Red Book, which I talked about it a little earlier tonight. This was some 45 years after his death. He said, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. material burst forth from the unconscious. It was the prima materia for a life's work. A psychological types, a landmark book, it drew on this prima materia. And in a section, about 17 pages long, entitled The Relativity of the God Concept in Meister Eckhart, Jung asserts that Eckhart understands God as a function of the soul, and the soul as a function of God. Now, what did the Meister have to say, and where did it come from? A material burst forth from the unconscious. Jung had said about his experience. He felt Meister Eckhart must have had similar experiences. So Jung writes, strangely appealing is Eckhart's sense of inner affinity with God. We feel ourselves transported back into the spacious atmosphere of the Upanishads. Eckhart must have experienced a quite extraordinary enhancement of the value of the soul, that is, his own inner being, that enabled him to rise to a purely psychological and relativistic conception of God and of his relation to man. Purely psychological and relativistic conception. And not quite the full picture. Eckhart, along with a number of other scholastic theologians, distinguishes between what he calls the God of creatures and the Godhead. Jung acknowledges this. He refers to Eckhart's own words, and these words are the ones that are on that handout that I've given you, but I'll read through them and you might want to follow here. This is Eckhart preaching to people. By being created, the soul created God. For he did not exist until the soul was made. A little while since, and I declared, I am the cause that God is God. God is God, not the soul, the Godhead he has of himself. God comes into being and passes away. You can see why the bishops would be a bit upset with this sort of stuff. Because all beings declare him, God comes into being. While I yet abode in the ground and the depths of the Godhead, in his flood and its source, none asked me whither I went or what I did. None was there who could have questioned me. But when I flowed forth, all creatures declared God. And why did they not declare the Godhead? All that is in the Godhead is one, and of that there is nothing to declare. Only God does. Godhead does nothing. There is nothing it can do, and never has it looked for anything to do. God and Godhead are as different as doing and not doing. When I come home again in God, I do nothing more of myself. So this, my breaking through, is much more excellent than my first going out. For truly it is I who bring all creatures out of their own into my mind and make them one in me. When I come back into the ground and depths of the Godhead, into its flood and its source, none asked me whence I came or whither I went. None miss me. God passes away. Well, the Meister's not easy reading. Even Carl Jung did not understand it at first. And it doesn't help that most of his sermons have survived in the form of notes taken by the audience, often the nuns in whose convents he often preached. Now, there are bound to be some departures from what he actually said. However, scholars have matched his sermons with his written treatises and are confident that what we have is faithful to his thought. Jung discusses Eckhart's theology in Ion. Jung says, Eckhart's theology knows a Godhead of which no qualities, except unity in being, can be predicated. It presents as an absolute coincidence of opposites. He then quotes Eckhart. Here's Eckhart talking about Godhead. Eckhart says, but its simple nature is of forms, formless, of beings, being less, of things, thing less. His language is difficult, often paradoxical. You know, so as too is Jung. You can't get far with either Eckhart or Jung unless you can live with paradox. Jung does not deny a metaphysical God. He professes most of the time to say nothing about the metaphysical God. He's concerned with the psyche and the images it produces, and in this case, the God image. Eckhart's statement that God's existence is dependent on the soul is equivalent to Jung's position that the God image arises out of the unconscious in the human psyche. Now, Jung stresses that this does not mean the God idea is made up. He insists, and I quote him, the God image is not something that's invented. It's an experience that comes upon man spontaneously. See, the God image is a fact, psychic fact, but no less a fact than a material fact. Jung warns us not to devalue God as just a psychic entity. The central thrust of Jung's work was to establish the objective reality of the psyche and the images that it experiences. So Jung insists we must repudiate the arrogant claim of the conscious mind to be the whole of the psyche, and to admit that the psyche is a reality which we cannot grasp with our present means of understanding. How these images arise in the psyche, it's not clear. Jung says it cannot be decided whether the God image is created or whether it creates itself. So far we've been speaking of the relativity of the God concept or the God image in terms of its coming into being, but there's another sense in which the God image is relative to human consciousness, and that concerns the content of the image and the changes and transformations in it over time. While the Godhead, we've spoken about, that's unchanging and unchangeable, the God image, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, has become increasingly complex over time. We have seen a creator God, a God expelling Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, a God who is a friend in intimate conversation with the patriarchs, an angry God punishing by a flood, a rescuing God in the Exodus from Egypt, a covenant-making God, a jealous God, an amoral God in the book of Job, and an all-perfect, loving Father God as proclaimed by Jesus. Now Jung says these utterances on the nature of the deity express transformations of the God image which run parallel with changes in human consciousness. The revelation experiences, arising from who knows where. Jung would say arising from the unconscious. They're not uncommon. Many individuals have them. But some of the God images that arise become collective, resulting in the birth of cultic practices and religious institutions. So, Moses' personal burning bush experience on Mount Sinai, for example, became the foundation of the Yahweh cult, which developed into Judaism. Paul's experience on the road to Damascus was the wellspring for his particular understanding of the Christian God image, which he elaborated in a series of letters. We can read them today. So, an example of consciousness reflecting on a foundational experience arising from the unconscious, Jung would say. Collective God images vary from one culture to another, and we know problems arise where adherents assert that only their particular tradition is the true one. So the next section, and it's on that list, is the search for meaning. And Jung used the quotation in Psychological Types that you have on that sheet to illustrate Eckhart's psychological and relativistic concept of the God image. However, it does more than that. It summarises Eckhart's understanding of the nature and purpose of his life, what might be called his personal myth. Eckhart speaks of the creation of the world as a flowing out from the Godhead. When I flowed out, says Eckhart, he presents himself as the I-ness of the cosmos,